Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed.
Hi, I'm Susan Bateman, and I started the Yarn Barn back in 1971. Since the beginning, it's been important to us to teach the crafts we love: weaving, knitting, crochet, and spinning. Last year, we had nearly 1,000 enrollments in our classes. We answered questions in-store, by phone, and through email. When you order from the Yarn Barn of Kansas, you aren't just ordering materials, you're supporting a business that can support you when you need help. See us at yarnbarn-ks.com.
I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Ann Merrow. Sarah Pedlow is an artist, educator, and ethnic embroidery enthusiast. Originally from California, she lives in Rotterdam, the Netherlands, and explores textile traditions wherever she goes. Sarah, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Ann.
So, your company and your website are Threadwritten. And at first I thought, well, it makes sense. She's writing about thread, but there's actually a bit more to it, right? Can you tell me about Threadwritten and what that means and where it comes from?
Yes. So I think about embroidery, which is the focus, my love, the focus of my business, as a language. You know, it's a pictorial language. People are documenting stories. They're documenting their identity, their lives, the motifs and patterns that represent who they are and where they come from. And that's a form of language. And I was actually just thinking about the idea of syntax. And what is syntax? Syntax is arrangement, right? Arrangement. So thinking about a pattern as a form of syntax and how we place different elements. So how we repeat elements. So it really is, embroidery is a system of signs and symbols, just like language, just like letter forms. So on that level, that's overarching with all of embroidery. But then on a more specific level, we have the work that started Threadwritten. It takes me back to 2009 when I was doing an artist residency program in Budapest. And my background is in fine art, and I was doing photography and mixed media work and installation, and was interested in Budapest as a vibrant city with an incredible history, and I had never been there. And so I ended up there for a month and was doing photography. And one day on a whim, I decided to go into the Ethnographic Museum in its former location near the Parliament building. And I walked into the display of the traditional clothing and was absolutely blown away. And I had done a little bit of embroidery as a Girl Scout and hadn't really thought much about it. I mean, I don't come from a real strong sewing background. I had done a little bit of stitching with my great aunt, and my grandmother sewed a lot of clothing for my mom and my aunt, and a little bit for me as a baby, but I didn't ever really do much with her as a child. And then actually in my early 20s, after I finished undergrad, before I went to grad school, I asked her to help me sew a dress. So I was back home and she helped me sew a linen dress using a pattern. So that was kind of my first sewing with a machine. And so anyway, so here I am in Budapest after an MFA at Rutgers and thinking more conceptually about art and materials and different things. And I see all of this clothing and I think, wow, this is really so much more than I thought. Embroidery can be so much more than I thought of, which was mostly home sweet home cross stitch. Or lazy daisies or something like that. So that there was a large display of dowry from Kalotazeg, from Transylvania, Romania. So that's seeing that display and the clothing led me to írásos, which is the style of embroidery that has, been sort of the heart of what I've done, and led me to travel to other places and research embroidery and learn from other people, and also bring other people to learn directly at the source with tours. And so, so that embroidery called írásos, which translates literally as written in Hungarian. So they were really seeing embroidery as a form of language, as a form of symbols, as a way of writing when one was illiterate. Some say that, peasants were doing that type of embroidery to write to their loved ones with
Wow.
these beautiful floral forms.
Yeah. And I should acknowledge before I go too far that I was fortunate enough to go with you on this tour to learn about írásos in Transylvania this year. So I don't want to pretend that that this is all fresh and new to me, but there are so many levels of it. So, but going back to embroidery as a language, my first thought was, oh, but it's a universal language. And then I thought, but it is absolutely not. There are, air quotes, dialects and symbology and things like that are just, the understanding of them is really specific and regional.
That's so true. Yeah, there are definitely a lot of overarching symbols, fertility symbols, the goddess, the idea of embroidery as being protective. But when you go to a specific place and you see how they're applying that, the technique, the stitches that they're using, even when they're within the same vocabulary, there are specific details and that are really specific to the place and sometimes to a family and to kind of a legacy of the person and then their individual hand, even of how they're working with something.
And so this írásos, it is quite specific to a particular region. What sort of characterizes it? And what was it that was particularly appealing to you about it?
So the embroidery is all done in one color, traditionally red, blue, black, or white. And the forms are floral. The composition, for the most part, we also see birds, but there are no human depictions. And we see a relationship with Turkish textiles and looking historically at the rule of the Ottoman Empire in the area. And so it's very easy to see a connection with the Turkish and wealthy Turkish people coming in and often and bringing their embroidery, right? And then servants would be embroidering, and then that would filter into the rest of the culture and other people picking up those patterns and motifs and stitching them. So there's a tulip, there's a rose. Compositions really fill the space. There's not a lot of open, empty space. And so kind of characteristic.
It's pretty much all one stitch.
It's all one stitch, yes, very important. It's all one stitch, which translates as the open chain stitch. And there are different ways to create that stitch. Often you'll see it with the stitches spaced out so that there is room in between each one and you see the fabric beneath. But the special and challenging element of using the stitch in the írásos form is that they are all right close together with no space and no fabric shows. And so your challenge is to make them close together and to keep the width of the line consistent. And as you know, it's not so easy.
as it's not, it looks easy. It's easy in concept. It's difficult in practice. Yeah. So do you think that as somebody who is, okay, so what I'm coming at is I look at your work and I think, wow, that is just so precise and amazing. Do you think that having a background working with your hands as an artist translated at all to your embroidery skills? Or do I just have to practice a lot more, Sarah?
I think practice is a huge part of it, no matter what, because it's definitely taken me a lot of practice, and I'm often going back and forth from different techniques. And so when I return to another technique, like one from Portugal, for instance, where we're going with a tour group in about a month, I think, okay, wow, I better brush up on this because it's time to go back to this part of the world now and work on this again. And so
Right.
I think, I don't know, I think like anything, it just takes time to learn the
Yeah.
skill and get better at it.
So your practice as an artist and your interest didn't particularly involve embroidery before this experience in Budapest at the museum, but do you think that kind of opened your eyes to embroidery all over? Because I've noticed that, you have a lot of, you're working in Portugal and you have started to go to other places and look at their embroidery.
Without a doubt. And it really changed my focus when traveling, because now whenever I go anywhere, that's the focus. And I think it's so much more enriching to travel with a purpose. And so when I'm traveling, I'm looking for embroidery. I'm looking for people who still embroider. I'm looking for people who embroider in a specific way that's of their culture, that is specific to that place. And so it's wonderful. It's a way to connect with people rather than just going and seeing the sights. And I think that's what's really special about textile practice, is the art and the craft of it. And I feel connecting with a lineage of makers all over the world and throughout time, really. So even though there's not as strong of a link, there is a little bit, but my mom has never really been a sewer or an embroiderer. But so there is some link in my family, but I don't feel that so strongly. But yet I feel a sense of connection, even through learning as an adult and coming in as an outsider to these places and learning from the women there.
And now a word from our sponsors. Peace Fleece began in a small Maine town with a mission to produce a yarn that brings together parties from areas of historic conflict, transcending boundaries through the commerce of wool. From Russian farmers to the Navajo Nation, the original owners set the foundation for meaningful trade. Today, the spinning mill at Harrisville Designs continues the tradition of sourcing fine wool from Navajo farmers, combining it with U.S. wool and a touch of mohair to create the unique Peace Fleece blend. Visit our website at peacefleece.com to learn more. Eucalan is your go-to delicate wash for the fibers you love. Whether you're blocking a shawl, freshening up handspun, or preserving a vintage knit, Eucalan's no-rinse formula with lanolin keeps your work clean, soft, and cared for. Biodegradable, gentle, and available in 5 lovely scents, because your craftsmanship deserves the best. Learn more at eucalan.com. And now back to the show. So, the embroidery that you do in your fine art work, because you have these two things going on at the same time, right? I mean, you are traveling to see other people's traditions, but your own artistic practice is now a lot of embroidery. Is that right?
Yes, it's a combination of embroidery and photography. It's actually started during COVID. I started stitching on just prints out of my laser printer because it was, everything was shut down. And so working with photographs, I'm always taking a lot of photos on the street now just with my phone. And I was really thinking about, I lived in Amsterdam for 5 years and I was there during COVID, and I was thinking about being in a place with such a rich history and living on top of a swamp and thinking about all of the stuff that has been discarded into the swamp over the years and preserved. In the Amsterdam Museum, you see a leather shoe that I forget what year it's from, but it goes way back, that was preserved, in the water. And so I think a lot about layering and layering of time and experience and materials. And so my art practice is kind of a collage process that involves stitching and on imagery and also on textiles too. So I've been working on some pieces that are related to parts of clothing that have embroidered motifs. And there's also a bit of a collage-like process working with motifs from different places and some that have become more emblematic of certain cultures, like the Hungarian tulip, for instance. So,
Mhm.
yeah, so I feel like that's a very poetic kind of practice. It feels more abstract and more, I'm not quite sure how to put it, but I think it ends up being more of kind of a distillation of my experiences and travels and the things that I'm seeing and picking up and putting them together in a way that's a little bit more distilled, kind of minimalistic. So my work in the past was really always about line, and so I see that through fair in working with stitch and working with the thread. And then very much, I'm often working with the contour of a shape when I'm embroidering something, and the silhouette and that kind of thing.
I might be wrong about this, but my impression is that in terms of our current understanding of fine art, there's a lot of focus on things that are unique and individual and, maybe connected to a past, to a shared past, but are very much about one expression. And the kind of folk embroidery relies so much on a shared vocabulary and being part of a shared tradition. And I'm curious about how those things, first of all, do you think that makes any sense? And secondly, how do you think about those two things?
That makes a lot of sense. And I have a lot of conversations about this because of that art versus craft debate and what has gained value over the years, right?
Right.
And high art versus craft, and craft being devalued. And I guess I tend to still think of art as something being more conceptual, about the idea and an expression, a creative expression. And I took flamenco dance for a while when I was living in San Francisco. So I always kind of go back to that example of flamenco being an expressive art and versus the Sevillanas dance, which is a folk dance where you're repeating the same form over and over. And so they're both equally valuable in my mind. And so I think they're just different things. I think there's a different kind of expression happening in an artwork versus a craft where you are purely replicating a symbol. But that doesn't mean that the level of skill, the technique, etc., the beauty of the piece, and the meaning behind it aren't just as deep and layered and valuable as something that's, quote, an artwork.
So when we were visiting in Kalotaszek and we were seeing the very few people who are still doing írásos embroidery, there were, one place that we went was a church where there's still new work being created to honor certain, passages or things like that. I think a lot of us have the idea of, doing something with your hands for religious observance, but there was this whole tradition of dowry goods, which is not necessarily universal. And I know that you're also, doing some work in Portugal, and there's a particular kind of stitch that's really identified with rugs and things like that. So how are you seeing embroidery being used in these sort of shared experiences? Are there some that are kind of your favorites?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Let's see. I think, well, like so many things, the more you learn, the more interesting it becomes. And so, it's definitely been that way with the írásos. And I have always gravitated more towards free or surface embroidery rather than counted thread work. So when I was learning about the írásos, which is the style of rug making that they say dates back to the Moors in Portugal. And so the írásos stitch is a long-armed cross stitch that's still used to make rugs today there in the namesake village. So that's something that's really grown on me because I thought, I don't know, but the stitch is really beautiful. It looks the way with the long arm, the way the threads overlap makes it look a little bit more like a kind of a knit or a braid rather than just a repeated cross. And so that's very interesting. and learning about the processes of how people were dyeing fibers. You know, they're in the square there in Areolos. It used to be just full of dye vats. And so getting a peek at that is pretty amazing. But I have to say that I just love, I guess, generally surface embroidery, floral, 1800s, you know, from Europe. But then, of course, now that I say that, now I'm thinking about Eastern Europe, and I'm thinking about having taken a short trip to Lviv, Ukraine, back in 2017, and getting, you know, starting to look at all of the traditions there and looking at counted thread work that's not cross stitch and how they work with motifs there, and, you know, similarly in Romania. And so, you know, it's hard to choose. I was in Slovakia. I was just talking to someone on Instagram about Slovakia, and then I went back to my photos there and was like, oh, I really need to go back and maybe create a tour there, because I just feel like there's so many amazing clothing traditions and stitching practices that people don't know about, and just beautiful. It's so inspiring.
Well, and it feels a little bit like a race against time. I guess when I was asking about your favorites, part of it is that there's a sense that if we want to see it or save it, there are places that we have to go. Like, there are not that many people who are actually practicing írásos now. And, you know, certainly making items for a dowry is not even there. I mean, I don't want to project my expectations everywhere, but even there, it's less common than it used to be, right?
Yes, true. So yeah, hardly anybody is doing anything related to a dowry anymore. When we were in northern Portugal for our tour in Viana do Castelo, the first tour that we did in 2019, a woman who was working with us, who was helping with meals, she brought in a handkerchief that her sister had made in like around the year 2000. It was a fiance's handkerchief, which is part of their tradition. And so that was kind of like a dowry, not exactly dowry, but in that vein. I was like, someone's actually still doing this. This is amazing. So yeah, it does feel like fewer and fewer people are working in all of the places that I go, really. There in some, like with the írásos, it's really dying out. People are leaving the villages because they need to move, you know, to have a better life. And so the children and the grandchildren of the women who we learn from are not doing the work anymore. In other places, there is more of a cottage industry for people who are dressing for feast days, like in Catholic traditions, like in Portugal, for instance. There are still a lot of people in the north who are dressing, and even orders from Brazil connected with Portugal to dress up for the holidays, the feast days, the celebrations in the city. So that's still happening in a lot of places, but it really does seem like the embroidery and the traditional clothing are really going to be something that we just see in museums in the not too distant future.
And that was just one of the really kind of astonishing things about taking the trip. Well, first of all, was the surprise. When people say Transylvania, I think Dracula. And when people say Romania, I think Grimm and Soviet. And it was, I've been saying to people, if Snow White's bluebirds had come to make my bed in the morning, I would not have been surprised. It was that beautiful and pastoral and green and lovely. But they were the folks who were still, you know, living in a very small group of people living in a village life. But on the other hand, they have folks coming to them who might not otherwise. So there's a little bit of going both ways. You don't just have the synthetic fabrics coming in. You also have people who have heard about the tradition and want to see it. Unfortunately, more of one than the other. But
yeah. So there is a nice exchange that we're helping to keep alive, I think, you know, helping to learn and share these traditions. Yeah.
One of the things I found surprising was we went to a flea market, and you also mentioned that when you were there for, I think it was for your residency, that you went to a flea market essentially, and found textiles. And when I visit a flea market, I'm expecting to see old furniture, broken lamps, and records. So, and there were all of those things, but so many booths that had old textiles was really surprising to me. Were you surprised to find such an interesting piece of cloth? And then do you find that that's something that you find in flea markets everywhere?
Not at all. Like, I was in Krakow for the first time, and I went to the flea market there, and it was, as you described, it was, broken things and, clothes and great food selection. There was a food market and interesting selection of books, of course, which I don't speak Polish. So, but yeah, no textiles really that were valuable for me. So it's just a lucky thing that there are still textiles in that particular market that we visit. And then also, I think I did get lucky in visiting that flea market. And so it just really depends. I think in Hungary generally, I would say there is a little bit, maybe more knowledge and appreciation of their various textile traditions and regional clothing. And so you can still find pieces there. And sometimes, and there are women who are showing up and trying to sell. In some cases, there's one community of people who are ethnic Hungarian in Romania and Transylvania, from Szék in Hungarian or Sikh in Romanian. And they very much are business people with their textiles. So there are people still doing their form of embroidery, which is similar to the írásos, and selling that. It's a little bit of a different feel to it. So it's kind of a different hand, but similar stitch, often with acrylic rather than cotton. So the írásos traditionally was with cotton. So I don't know.
But these are also pieces that have lasted long enough that you could wear them and still have them be saleable.
Yes, for sure. So the piece that I bought at the market, they told me was over 50 years old, and it's beautiful. It's on linen, I believe, and in great condition, cotton on linen, and so there are still pieces out there. I think it's getting harder and harder to find the hand-spun, hand-woven fabric. You can still find some of that on rolls at the various markets, but less and less of just pure hemp or pure linen. You'll find like a combination cotton and linen more frequently now.
Yeah. So as you learn about these different traditional stitches and motifs, do you find that it influences your artwork at all?
I had one person ask me if I was using the írásos stitch in my work, and I'm not actually using it. And so I thought, gee, do I have to be that literal? Do I have to use, the Hungarian stitch with the thing, with the this in order for that to work for you? So so it's all going in there. I think I'm really interested in clothing in the body as sculpture. And so very interested in sleeves. And so there's kind of an interplay between working with the decorative patterns and motifs and how they're applied to something that becomes three-dimensional. And so, I'm often working with very basic stitches and not directly using the stitches that we learn when I'm traveling with people or teaching a workshop necessarily. So I think it's more of it's kind of just like a foundation of knowledge and something that's sort of in my head and in my body that moves into what I do.
Well, I was thinking, going back to the language as a framework of thinking about it, there are certain sounds that you learn to make when speaking certain languages, or certain idioms that are part of certain languages that, sort of take on a different tone when they're transposed. So I wonder if it's, maybe not the írásos stitch, but an open chain or, I learned to move my needle this way.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. I wonder if it influences.
Yeah, that's such a nice way to think about it. Yes, because I think that naturally through the process of sitting with women and learning from them, and I'm picking up maybe some habits in the way that I'm stitching and how I'm holding myself and using my body, and am I tucking the fabric under my knee and holding it under tension rather than using a hoop? Sometimes I do that, and so it's really lovely to think about it that way, to think about it almost like an accent, having an accent when speaking a language or using a certain phrase, and that does work its way into the use of a color in a certain place or a line or a stitch.
Mm-hmm. Now we're talking a little bit about your artwork and also exploration, but teaching is also a very big part of what you're doing. I mean, you've written several pieces for Piecework magazine and designed a piece based on a chain stitch, I think, for Piecework, the most recent Piecework. But you are also teaching people how to do certain stitches and also taking them to places and teaching them about the traditions. How do you approach that sort of teaching as somebody who's also learning and exploring and making art?
That's a great question. Yeah, very humbly, because I see myself as an ambassador for these traditions. And so I come in saying, I'm coming to this as a beginner with this experience, having learned it from these people and trying to share what I know. And so in the case of the workshops, giving cultural and historical context and passing on the stitch, passing on motifs, and hopefully giving people a richer understanding than a lot of craft classes where maybe you're just making something and there's not a lot of other information to go with it. And then taking people to the source to actually learn directly from people. So I'm happy to share the skill that I've learned, but I think the real gold is to learn directly from the people who are not going to be with us forever, right? Who are still doing this, and it's really a part of who they are. Mm-hmm. So,
and I'm just struck by this idea that you're in this museum in Budapest and you see this piece of fabric and you think, I need to learn more about this. And the next thing you know, you're in a foreign country trying to navigate in language that you don't speak, meeting people who are completely outside the realm of what you would normally encounter. So how do you go about discovering these things?
Just a lot of research and a lot of serendipity goes into it. When I think about my first trip to Romania, which was in 2012, 3 years after that residency in Budapest, and I went with a link to a couple that we visit on the trip who I had learned that they rent out a room and they speak a little English, and the man's a traditional wood carver and a woman is very knowledgeable about collects textiles and has organized exhibitions. And so I went and stayed with her and went with a very open mind about it and just held it very lightly. I often think back to my attitude about that trip and think, okay, how can I adopt that now in my life in whatever situation, to just hold it lightly and say, okay, well, we'll see how this goes. We'll see what happens. And I just started asking people. So I would ask the woman working in the guest house where I was staying, who had a Hungarian sounding name, if she knew anyone who did írásos. And that led to a great story of actually getting to meet her mother, who was about to discard some of the pillowcases she had made. So her daughter, who was working at the front desk, called a taxi and put me in the taxi, and they drove me over to this communist, apartment building, cement apartment building. And this woman, opened the door of the cab and handed me a plastic bag with a couple pillowcases in it. And I just said, "Köszönöm szépen," several times in, thank you very much in Hungarian, which was almost nearly the extent of my Hungarian. And, and then we closed the door, and then the cab took me back to the guest house. And then I had these pillowcases. So sometimes you get lucky and things like that happen. And then sometimes it takes more work. It takes, in traveling since then, I realized like, okay, it's about repeated visits. It's about building relationships. It takes a lot of perseverance, I think, and to find your way to the people who are interested in connecting and working together.
And a willingness to be uncomfortable, not necessarily in a deep physical or threatening way, but to kind of go around thinking, I don't know where I'm going to go. I don't know whom I'm going to meet. I don't know what they're going to think, but I'm going to do it anyway. It reminds me of, I spoke with Irene Wagner, who spent quite a bit of time in Morocco learning the knitting traditions there. And then she learned about sock knitting in Armenia and just walked around, found a woman who was about the right age and said, do you knit? Do you knit?
So great.
And a lot of us, I think, would just not be comfortable with that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting. I feel very much that I'm an introvert, and but for some reason, it feels okay to ask people if they embroider, if their mother or their grandmother embroidered, or just to start talking about textiles. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'm not sure why. I'm not sure why that feels okay, but it does. Not all the time, of course. Just you have to kind of get a feel for the situation and the people, and get kind of a gut read on who's going to be receptive. But
one of the things I found most interesting on the tour, which was overall just a delightful and very comfortable experience, but the parts that stuck with me were the times when I deliberately focused on being uncomfortable. Like, for example, in the market, where negotiation is just the name of the game. That's how things work. And we got a little bit of coaching, but for people who are accustomed to seeing the price on things, it's not comfortable to go in and ask for a discount or negotiate hard. And I pushed myself to do that. And I did it because there were some gorgeous textiles that I really wanted.
Well done. Good for you. It is hard. It is hard, I think, to go in and say, no, I want to give you half, and then start, bargaining with that. It takes guts for sure. So, yeah.
I set myself a challenge. I want to negotiate hard enough that they will let me walk away. But then I realized the problem was it was something that I really wanted. So then I had to figure out how to go back.
Did you get it? You got it?
I did get it. Yep.
Nice.
Yep. I got it. It's a narrow woven belt. I think it's just a band weaving piece of band weaving.
Nice. Beautiful.
So, but it's a totally different thing to go from learning, research for yourself to thinking about bringing along other people. And what made you decide that this was something that you wanted to do? And how do you think about putting together a group to go someplace that they would never otherwise go?
I think just my passion for the people, for the textiles, for valuing these places and these people that often don't get much attention, and thinking that people need to experience it. That I just wanted people to share and learn and help preserve what they're doing. So that's really the impetus. And yes, I end up often going to places that you would never think to go. Like if, I went to a folk festival in the Czech Republic a couple years ago with my partner, and I'm always laughing because I'm dragging him to these places. It might not look so interesting, but then there's a festival, and then you get to go into someone's house, and then, the world opens up, you see their textiles and things change. So there's just a lot of joy in doing that. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, how to do that, I think I just start with Well, I start with what I'm interested in, right? So that determines the place, and I want an experience that's down to earth and authentic, and
Right.
where people can.
Wouldn't this be cool?
Exactly, right? It doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be, this
Right.
is beautiful, and how can we learn this? Who can teach us?
Mm-hmm.
And yes, Transylvania is a lot more, so much more than Dracula. You know, I remember when I first traveled there, I was telling people and they were saying, "Oh, that's a real place," you know, so.
Darn it, Bram Stoker.
You know. So we have a nod to the Dracula lore, and, talk about Vlad the Impaler and all of that. But obviously there's a whole other there are worlds within worlds, like, different groups of people, so many different groups of people and cultures in Romania. For example, it's so rich. And then in Portugal, the different sort of microcultures in the different regions there are also really beautiful. So,
because you do 2 different experiences in Portugal, is that right?
Yes, we do one in the north in Viana do Castelo, revolving around a festival where there were over 1,000 women in traditional dress on parade.
Oh, wow.
And then we do another trip around the Areolos rug making, and then the UNESCO World Heritage City, Evora, which is about 20 minutes away, which has a Roman ruin and a beautiful architecture and just, a very ancient city. And we also go to Lisbon. This year we're doing an extended trip in that area and also going to Sintra. So, so we have those 2 trips there. And then I'm working on the details, getting together a trip to Estonia next year. So that is very exciting. I went to Estonia a few years ago, and there's, again, so much variety and intricacy to the different regional clothing and their textile traditions. So I'm excited about that. That's going to be in July. And I visited La Gartera, Spain, which is near Toledo. They have, which was the inspiration for my project in piecework. And so that is just an incredible, over-the-top, maximalist tradition of clothing. It seems like they do every kind of practice of needlework, counted thread work, free embroidery. They have a lot of chain stitching. They make lace. They have some cut felt. And so I'm putting together a tour that will be in June to experience Corpus Christi, which is where everyone is just decked out. I mean, they bring out their textiles and make altars on the street. And if you haven't been to Toledo and you haven't been to the cathedral in Toledo, it is absolutely exquisite, like just over the top on another level. So that's what I'm working on currently for next year, and hopefully a tour in Bulgaria in 2027. So just starting that.
Wow. I've heard quite a bit about the different Estonian knitting traditions. I think there are some folks, Nancy Bush and Marika Sarnit, a number of people who have done quite a lot of work in the knitting of that region. I don't know as much about the embroidery in that region. Are you looking at a broad variety of textiles, or are you mainly focusing on embroidery?
We are going to be looking a bit at weaving traditions and knitting, likely going to Haapsalu for their lace shawls. But I am focusing more on the embroidery, and specifically from Muhu Island, which they were knitting and embroidering and, doing everything there. But they have a tradition of making wedding blankets with a much larger scale embroidery than we think of normally. So big floral patterns. And so that's going to be the focus. There's also floral embroidery on black fabric, a merino wool that was used to make, or still is used to make, shoes and different things. But I'm really interested in these very big, bold floral patterns that are more expressive, I guess, than the black. The work on black sometimes is a little bit more realistic looking, and I really like kind of the folk look, which is not aiming at realism.
So all of this time that you're spending on the road, because we've talked about, is that something like 4 or 5 tours next year? Are you kind of working on your own practice as you go along, or do you find that you have travel time and studio time? How is that integrating into your life?
This year, there's been a lot of travel for me. I've traveled more this year than I have in the past. So what has happened is my life gets a little segmented. So the travel time with the tours is pretty all engrossing. And so I come back, and then that's when I'm back here now living in Rotterdam, and that's tends up being the studio time. So like right now I'm kind of diving into a project for a deadline in September, and working on that. So yeah, I think sometimes I do have ongoing projects that I can bring with me and do a little stitch here and there, or something I work on the plane. So it's really nice when that happens to have that be on more of a continuum, but more often it ends up being kind of divided.
I was thinking about the photography element that, we can take photos so many places now that you could make yourself a little stockpile.
Oh, and I do. Yes, for sure. So thank you. Yeah. That is something that is always happening, no matter what. And that plays into the work when I come back. So yeah, I do have I do need to go through my photos and sort out certain categories and have some prints made.
One of the things we've been talking about, these exquisite embroidery stitches that people practice throughout their lives. But one of the things I think is really exciting about going to places and admiring textiles and practicing a stitch or two is, yes, there is richness that develops as you go on, but there isn't really a barrier to entry necessarily. There's not, you must have created your first cross-stitch sampler by the age of 10 to go on this trip.
Yes, I try to make it very accessible so that people with no experience can show up and can try. And I say that it's open to textile enthusiasts, artists and makers. So even if you have, never embroidered, or maybe you feel like, I'm all thumbs or something, and I'm not really a maker, but I'd love the textiles, or I'm really interested in travel and cultural immersion, then you're welcome. And I feel like even if you're not interested in stitching with us, there are other things you can do, or you can sit and just people watch, right? You can watch the interaction and see, and there's just so much to learn in that.
So one of the experiences of being on the tour is that we're essentially kind of, not just taking advantage of what you know, but really like following in your footsteps. So you have this lens of having come from a similar background to a lot of the people who are on your tours, in terms of the way we grew up stitching. And we get to kind of see, here's how I learned about this, which is like, here's how you can take a step in and learn about it too. So when you're on one of the tours, what do you think your experience is besides sort of facilitating?
Yeah, I'm there as a facilitator and a guide and sort of creative guidance, I would say. In some of the tours I offer, there's more of a kind of an art component. So in Portugal, in the trip coming up in a month, we're going to be staying at an artist residency property, and we're going to be learning írásos, but we're also going to be having time for working on personal projects. So I'm there to teach and guide through making something more creative for people who want to do so, and also guiding through the írásos work when we're not with our local teacher or local instructor. So I think I see myself as an ambassador for the place and the culture, as sort of a guide coming to the experience, having approached as an outsider and coming in and learning and I guess providing that example and providing that introduction and entryway, and then hopefully being an inspiring guide for the time of the trip and into the future. I mean, that thing that I really love about this, in addition to, the embroidery and the travel and all of that, is the friendships that I make with the people who attend. So I feel like I'm always sort of staying in touch or sending somebody an image and saying, oh, isn't this great? And, there's just always really wonderful people who come on the trips. And so we create a nice creative community together.
Yes, they were lots of fun. And also, some of these are also the subjects of classes that you are teaching. So, we're going to the place, but also kind of taking the class as well.
Yeah, right. It's a combination of both. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And so some folks are taking these classes online at, I think, through Tatter and a number of other places. But
so I offer classes through my platform at threadwritten.com. And then I've also taught a lot with Tatter, going back to before I moved to the Netherlands. And so, and other institutions, I sometimes teach in person with Crafts Council Nederland. And I'm teaching an online class again through the New York Botanical Garden in December.
Oh, wow.
And so I've taught at the John C. Campbell Folk School in North Carolina. So I like to kind of branch out and teach with other organizations when I can.
Well, Sarah, I am so glad that I managed to catch you during one of your rare periods at home. And I am already looking at your next tours and thinking, wouldn't it be fun?
Oh, so, Anne,
thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. And I do hope to see you in another destination soon.
Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.